All right, hello, welcome back, everybody. PayPal and Patreon are down below if you want to support me. Only do so if you actually can. Apologize if my voice sounds a little bit distorted. I got sick, so I am a bit congested at the moment. So we got the economic year-end data from the IMF with everyone's at least initial GDP level updates for the end of 2024. And as for the graphs specifically on the Trading and Economics website, and we've learned that site does not update those graphs until around June. So unfortunately, you're not going to see the updated number, but we do have the numbers themselves. So again, the visible graphs that will be on screen are only going up through 2023. The total global economy after rebounding from its COVID crash. In 2021, it was at $98 trillion. 2022, it climbed up to 101 trillion. 2023, last year, it climbed up to 105. And as of the end of this year, the total global economy is roughly $110 trillion. Now, factoring in for inflation, technically the global economy has not really grown, as inflation factoring $98 trillion from the end of 2021 is actually equal to about $110 trillion right now. Now, plenty of individual countries have continued growing economically. So, starting with the US, obviously remaining the number one economy, and that is not changing. We've kind of passed the point where the signs have been given that that's not going to be altered. 2021, the year of its COVID rebound, the US went up to 23.7 trillion. 2022, it went up to about 25. 2023, last year, it went up to 27.3. And this year, it is closing the year out at 29.2 trillion. And it was overall inflation defeating growth. As accounting for inflation, the $23.7 trillion of the end of 2021 would be equal to around or a little bit above 26 trillion right now. China has been stagnant for 4 straight years now at about $18 trillion for their total economic size, fluctuating up and down, a bit above 18, a bit below 18, a bit above 18 again. This year in particular, they're ending this year at 18.3. Germany and Japan recently swapped places. Japan had been up at around 5 trillion. However, they've been declining for the last number of years. Last year, they declined down to 4.21. This year, they've declined down to 4.07. So they're now in the number 4 spot, with India about to take that spot from them next year. And Germany has now moved up to the number 3 spot and will hold that until probably 2028 is when India will then take that spot from them. Germany grew over the course of this year from 4.46 up to 4.71 trillion. India has grown decently and consistently, well outdoing the pace of any inflation. They went from around, or actually, I think just below $3 trillion of economic size in 2021, up to now ending this year almost at 4, at 3.9 trillion. The UK wobbling around 3 trillion usually for quite a while now. Although these last 2 years you have jumped up a bit suddenly from being around 3 up to last year 3.34, and now ending this year just under 3.6, coming in at 3.59 trillion. France has been doing the same thing as the UK, wobbling around a face value of 3 trillion for many years, and they were actually slipping down, but now they're climbing back up as well. And this year they climbed up from 3.03 to 3.17 trillion. Italy has been hovering around 2 trillion for a while and has started recently slightly making their way up a bit. This year climbing from 2.25 up to 2.38 trillion. Canada seems to finally be climbing upwards after stalling for a little bit at 2 trillion themselves as well. This year continuing to climb from 2.14 up to 2.21 trillion. Brazil has been in the 2 trillions before, then they contracted down below that during the 2010s. Recently, they've been making their way back into that range. However, it looks like they're starting to stall out again. This year only going from 2.17 up to 2.19 trillion. Russia reporting in as 2.18, a little sus though, since oil and gas prices contracted decently this year, and oil and gas revenue is still 30 to 40% of their economy. So if they were giving realistic numbers, that would have seen an actual visible drawdown. South Korea is continuing to climb up after briefly stalling around 1.5. They last year they got up above 1.7. Now they jumped all the way up to 1.87 trillion. Mexico is making their way up in the world, and they will actually be getting into the top 10 soon enough. Last year having jumped up to 1.79, this year continuing upwards to 1.85 trillion. Australia has wobbled around in the upper ones between 1.5 and 2 for a while. This time going on an upswing for this year in particular from 1.72 up to now 1.8 trillion. Spain going up from 1.58 up to 1.73. Indonesia continuing their steady growth and making their way up towards 1.5, going from 1.32 up to 1.37 last year, and a little bit slower this year from 1.37 up to 1.4 trillion. Turkey starting to make their way up through the 1 trillions, getting up to 1.11 last year, and this year jumping upwards actually to 1.34. Netherlands actually now is climbing up into the 1 trillions as well, having gotten over 1 trillion a couple of years ago, and last year getting up to 1.12, now jumped up by another 100 billion to $1.22 trillion. Saudi Arabia is having domestic growth outside of just its oil and gas revenue. However, actually, whoever actually legitimately reporting economic numbers, they've shown their growth as stalling because of the decline in oil and gas prices over the course of last year and now this year as well. So they've stalled out around 1.1 trillion for the last few years, now down into the sub 1 trillion economies. Switzerland, having climbed from 818 up to 885 billion last year, this year has climbed from 885 up to 942 and is slowing down and will be slowing down further again soon enough to be overtaken by Poland, Polska, on their way up towards that 1 trillion line. They last year jumped up to 811 and this year have climbed up further to 863 billion. Taiwan has kind of been leveling off in the upper 700s area, usually between 750 and 780. This time coming in that same area again at 775 billion. Belgium is in the 600s this year, over the course of this year, going up a bit from 632 up to 662. Sweden has been hanging around 600 or so, and this time they actually, as of the end of this year, have jumped a bit back above it from 593 up to 609 billion. Argentina has taken a bit of a downward tumble. They were at 640 billion at the end of last year. Now they've dropped back down to 604. Ireland is continuing their steady climb upwards, this year making it up over 550 up to 561. Singapore now climbing through the 500 billions and hitting 549. Thailand starting to stall out in the 500s. They've been wobbling a bit, though this time they made it up a bit higher than previously, up to 545 billion. The UAE now climbing their way upwards through the 500s, and this time came in at 545. Austria has been wobbling around 500 or so, and this time came in at 536 billion. Israel has been doing similar, this time coming in at 528. Norway has been bouncing around between 500 and 600, this time coming in at 504 billion. Malaysia hit a snag last year, but this year, over the course of this year, they made up for that and grew by what they would have grown this year by itself, jumping up from the lower 400s up to jumping up into the upper 400s, coming in at 489. The Philippines continuing their steady growth up towards half a trillion this year, coming in at the end of this year, 471. Vietnam continuing their steady march up towards half a trillion as well, going this year from 430 up to 468 billion. Bangladesh beginning to break down, wobbling around the lower 400s and upper 300s as things have been off and on kind of falling apart. This year they managed another recovery year, getting back up to 451. Iran stagnant for many obvious reasons, wobbling around roughly 400 right now. This year in particular, coming in at 434. Colombia making its way up into the 400s now, coming in at 417 billion as of the end of this year. Denmark playing around the 400 area as well. This year going up to 412 billion. Egypt going back down into the 300s recently, now coming back up above 400. This time they're ending this year at 411 billion. South Africa had been up around 500, but as the country has gradually deteriorated and everything's become dilapidated and falling apart, their power grid, their rail network, their port infrastructure, their water distribution system, they've meandered their way down to 400, even below 400 last year, getting down to 380. This year they bumped back up to 403 billion. Romania is rocketing their way upwards through the 300s. They seem to be gunning for that half a trillion mark. They this year they went from 351 up to 381 billion. Pakistan has been falling apart in various ways, similar to Bangladesh, and they're wobbling all over the place, up and down, 400s, 300s. This time they had a rebound year, going from 338 up to 375. The Czech Republic gradually making their way up through the 300s, this year climbing from 331 up to 343. Chile meandering around in the lower 300s, this time coming in at 329, which is down from last year where they ended the year at 336 billion. Finland had been wobbling around a bit under 300. Now, though, they're starting to creep a bit above it. Last year they got to 300 exactly. This year, they're up to 306 billion. Portugal has gone up past 300 now, hitting 303 billion, up from 287 last year. Kazakhstan is closing in on 300 very quickly, and they might get pretty close to half a trillion, actually. They might actually get pretty close to half a trillion by 2030, by the end of the 2020s decade. And now, as of the end of this year, up to 293 billion. Peru is closing in on 300 as well, having made it from 243 up to 268, and now up to 283 billion. Iraq, kind of wobbly, as they're a bit more dependent on oil and gas revenue than other Gulf nations like the UAE. Or this year in particular, they came in at 264, and Algeria climbing up through the 200s as they have been economically diversifying. A lot of a lot of manufacturing has actually been moving in to Algeria, and over the last 3 years, they've gone from 192 to 240, and now up to, as of the end of this year, 260 billion. Greece just making it over 250 this year, coming in at 253. New Zealand has been starting to peter out around 250 and actually went down a tiny bit from 253 at the end of last year to now ending this year at 251 billion. Hungary is now up over 200 and climbing through it, having gotten up to 212 last year and now ending this year at 229 billion. After suffering a bit of pull down from the decline of oil and gas prices, dropping from 236 down to 221. Nigeria was once up around or closing in on 500. However, they have been tumbling their way down over the last number of years, and there may be corrections to this later, but it looks like they've gone all the way down now to only 200 billion for the end of this year. 200 billion was where Ukraine was before the war started. And for 2022, since the invasion did not have the full conquesting desired effects that Putin would have wanted, their economy was not actually destroyed as everyone was expecting it to be. They did drop substantially by about 20%, though, down to 161, and they recovered in 2023 up to 179, and a little bit further this year from 179 up to now 184 billion. Kuwait wobbling around in the 100s, this year coming in at 162. Morocco climbing their way up through the 100s from 131 up to 141, and now over the course of this year up to 157. Ethiopia has tried to climb up through the 100s, but keeps stopping itself having internal having internal civil wars and genocide attempts. Last year they did bounce up to 164, but this year they have contracted back down to 145. Slovakia is now surging up through the 100s from 115 up to 133, and now this year up to 143. The Dominican Republic in the Caribbean has maintained their pretty consistent growth, having last year gotten from the 100 and teens up to 121. This year, growing from 121 up to 126 billion. Ecuador being held back by fallen oil prices, so they only managed to go up from 119 up to 121. Kenya continuing their way up more gradually through the 100s, growing from 107 at the start of this year, end of last year, up to now 116. Angola fluctuating all over the place. This year in particular, coming in at 113. Uzbekistan now up in the 100s, having grown from 91 last year up to now 113 as of the end of this year. And Guatemala now starting to make their way steadily up through the 100s, having gone from 95 up to 102 last year, and over the course of this year, going from 102 up to 112. Oman being held back by low oil and gas prices, only managing to go from 108 up to 110 this year. Bulgaria now up in the 100s and growing this year from 102 up to 108. Costa Rica getting close to 100, having grown this year from 86 up to 95 billion. Luxembourg over the last few years growing from 82 up to 86, and now this year up to 91 billion. Croatia has just hit 90 billion, growing from 72 up to 83 up to now 90. Panama is on their way up towards that area as well, growing from 77 up to 83 last year, and over the course of this year, now up to 87. Cote d'Ivoire coming in at 87 as well, having grown upwards from 79 last year and up from 70 flat the year before that. Sri Lanka having fallen down, and now they've stopped their descent but are stagnant and wobbling around the 80 range, a bit above, a bit below. This time this year falling back below 80 down to 75. Turkmenistan having some inconsistencies in their growth pattern. They are decently dependent on natural gas prices in particular. This year they did grow though up to 83 billion. Lithuania over the last few years growing from 71 up to 78, and this year slowing down a little bit from 78 up to $83 billion. Uruguay going from 71 up to 77 last year, and ending the year now at 83 as well. Serbia also at 83, up from 75 last year. Tanzania kind of having a stall year. The previous year, they grew from 74 up to 79 billion. This year, they only went from 79 up to 80. Azerbaijan fluctuating decently as they are pretty dependent on oil and gas revenues, again, more than they should be. This year, they came in at 76 billion. Ghana decreased a little bit as they've stalled out in the mid 70s over the last few years. 74 for 2022. Then they ended last year at 76. Now they've ended this year down by one at 75. Slovenia has gone from 60 up to 68 last year, and this year has continued growing from 68 up to 73 billion. Belarus going from 72 up to 73 billion for the end of the year now. The Congo, the big Congo, the huge unstable Congo where all the cobalt is, has made it up over 70, growing from 66 up to 72 billion. Myanmar down and stagnant because of the civil war has come in this time at 64. Uganda has broken above 50, going from 49 up to 56 this year. Cameroon has also reached 50, going from 44 up to 48, and then this year from 48 up to 53. Jordan has slowed down, only going from 51 up to 53 this year. Tunisia has made it above 50 again, I think. I believe they were up there before. Previously, they grew from 46, or technically that would be recovered from 46 up to 49. This year, they went from 49 up to 53 billion. Bolivia has almost reached 50 billion, ending this year at 48. Bahrain wobbles decently, this time coming in at 48 as well. Cambodia has been having rather quick growth, at least off and on, and this year had a decent jump from the 30s up to 47 billion. Latvia, over the last few years, has grown from 41 up to 44, and this year from 44 up to 46. Paraguay growing slowly from 42 up to 43 the previous year, and over the course of this year from 43 up to 45 billion. Libya fluctuating with oil and gas prices and its stability and the country's internal stability. This year they dropped back down from 50 to 45 billion. Nepal has grown from 39 up to 41 last year, and over the course of this year from 41 up to 44 billion. And Estonia is now in the 40s. They went from 38 up to 41, and this year from 41 up to 43. Honduras is continuing to climb pretty steadily now, from 32 to 34 last year, and this year from 34 up to 37. And that's the end of the top 100 or top 101 out of 194, I think. It depends who you ask. So I made it all the way through, even with my sick voice. There are a few more, but these are just completely random mentions for various reasons. Sudan was actually up around 100 previously. However, because of their civil war that started back in spring of 2023, they are now, as of this year, the end of this year, all the way down to only 27. Guyana, previously being around 5 or 6, has grown quickly, predominantly because of their newfound oil revenue, all the way up to now 21.2. However, a growing portion of that is other economic activity that is being spurred by all this newfound revenue that they have. Somalia, although still at small numbers, is growing decently percentage wise by roughly 10% or double digits each year for the time being, going from 10.4 up to 11.7, and this year up to 12.8 billion for their total economic size. And that's the end of this. So thank you everybody for sticking around and listening. Like if you enjoyed, subscribe if you haven't already. PayPal and Patreon are down there if you want to support me. Only do so if you actually can. There's a link in the description to a Google Drive with folders full of all kinds of different graphs and charts and data compilations across covering all kinds of different metrics of everything. That's free to access. Any of that is free to use. There's a link to my photography Instagram below that as well, and a link to my cat's YouTube channel in the top pinned comment. May God bless and protect all of you, and I will see you around next time.